I'm Jen Wittwer, and I'm 61 years of age, and I've been embarked on a second career about 5 years ago, of which I think a lot of it came from the service that I had given in the Royal Australian Navy, and initially in the Women's Royal Australian Naval Service, which was the service that I joined way back in 1981. I had a really good childhood and upbringing. My mother was a widow when I was born. My father had been a pilot in the Air Force, and he was killed in a flying accident at Point Cook on the 28th of June, 1961. And in fact, I just realised it's his anniversary tomorrow. And so, for a few years, my sister and I were the children of a woman who, she herself had served in the Women's Royal Australian Air Force before she married. She was a very strong, independent, resilient woman, and that's what I recall from a very young age. She had to work because there was no welfare, services back in those days. I remember we had to go and stay each day with this little old woman up the road who I recall was not very pleasant, but I think my mother really had no options but to, seek care for her children so she could go and work. That's my memories of my first few years. My mother remarried when I was about 5 or 6. She married a journalist, and who is still a good father to myself and my sister and 3 more siblings that I had after that. And the stories of my own father, pictures of my father, memorabilia from my father's service was very prevalent in my growing up as a young child and as a teenager. And I think really it was knowing those stories, getting a sense of knowing him as a Air Force person, as a pilot, looking very striking in his uniform, as I think men did in those days, and of my mother's service as well too, sort of led me to consider joining the military myself when I left school. And I had a very strong sense of wanting to work in an organisation, firstly that wore a uniform, because I actually went to a girls' high school in Sydney. There was a selective high school, and we had to wear, stockings and hats and gloves and practically and handbags. And in fact, I ended up joining the Women's Royal Australian Naval Service, where we still wore stockings and hats and handbags. So it was kind of like a very easy transition for me. But I guess when I was in high school, and I sort of thought, well, what is it that I wanted to do when I left school? I wanted to break out of the mould of doing what women did, really up until that point, which was generally banking, secretarial services, nursing, those kind of very admirable careers, but not for me. And I really wanted to do something where I felt that I was actually doing something that women would not normally do. So for me, it was about joining the military. Which of the 3 services? Well, of course, it could have been the Air Force, if I'd taken the example of my parents. It definitely wasn't going to be the Army, because I didn't want to dig holes and get dirty. And to be honest, and this sounds very superficial, but way back in the sort of the late 70s, early 80s, looking at the uniforms that the Navy people would wear, of course, the sailor's uniform is a traditionally kind of romantic notion, movies, Frank Sinatra in Ships Ahoy, and even the women were dressed in it was a white dress we commonly referred to as a bowling dress, because it looked a bit like the dress that women would wear when they're playing bowls. But at least it was some sort of uniform that we felt looked a bit more like a uniform than the Army or the Air Force. And so I thought, I'm just going to join the Navy. And it didn't really matter what job, because actually the range of jobs available to women back then were very, very limited. So originally when I applied to join the Navy, I was in year 11. And I went to the recruiting centre and I said, look, I'm doing year 12 next year and I'd like to join the Navy. What are some of the jobs that that I could do? And they said, well, you could be a driver, you could be a cook, you could be a steward, all those sorts of jobs. And I'm thinking, oh, okay, that sounds really good. The following year, I wrote to the recruiting centre and said, I've just finished my year 12 exams, these are my results, I'm still interested in joining the Navy. Next thing I know, they sent me out an application form to join as an officer. And to be honest, I didn't even know what an officer was. But the only 3 jobs that were available to women who were joining the Navy as an officer were administration, communications or logistics. This was to join the Women's Royal Australian Naval Service, not the Royal Australian Navy, which was the men's service. So I decided on logistics because I thought, well, at least that will probably give me some skills that I could use if I decided to leave the Navy and pursue a career outside of defence. So I went along to my recruiting, to my sort of officer selection board, which had a couple of male officers and a senior female officer. And, got the usual sort of lots of questions about why I wanted to join the Navy and what did I think it was all about. And actually asked me a few questions about ships, but in reality, I knew nothing about ships. And back then we weren't expected to because women didn't serve at sea. So I must have impressed with my, my intellect, my HSC results, I don't know, but they decided to offer me an opportunity to join as a midshipman and go to the Naval College. I have to say, some years later, the captain of the board, who was by this stage an admiral, I actually saw him at a function, and at that stage I'd cut my hair short, and he said to me, why did you cut your hair? And I said, well, I just wanted to do something different. He said, you know that I only let you into the Navy because you had long blonde hair. And this is about 1984, 1985, and it was really a sign of the times. It was the way in which men in the organisation didn't necessarily value women or didn't necessarily see women as equal to them because we were in our own service, because we did jobs that they had sort of the far more exciting combat-related or combat roles. Women were in these, kind of administrative roles. So I don't think we were taken seriously, and I think ask any woman of my vintage who went through their training at that time that they would say that. Things changed in 1984 with the introduction of the Sex Discrimination Act, which then required essentially the dismantling of the women's services and the transition of women from those women's services into the Royal Australian Navy, the Royal Australian Air Force and the Australian Army. And that also then signalled for everybody a significant change. That meant that women were going to be competing with men for promotions and for postings, still within those limited roles. But I have to say, when I look back on that time as a young midshipman, I was 19 or 20 years old. When I stepped off to the bus at the Naval College on the 6th of March 1981, I did not really understand what I had, what hit me, what I had joined. It was a shock, to be honest. I'd grown up in a household where I was encouraged, to get an education, to spread my wings, to choose what I wanted to do in terms of careers. But I really had no idea about what the workforce was like for women at that time. And I think it was magnified 100% in organisations like the military, in terms of how they treated women, the roles that women, the limited roles that women could undertake, the fact that they couldn't serve at sea, all those things that women and men now take for granted in their service, and I think that's great and that's the way it should be, was not the case when we joined. You would know from the number of inquiries that have been held, the Defence Abuse Response Task Force and so on, that there were significant issues around sexual assault, sexual harassment, pornography on walls in office spaces, sexist jokes. I mean, these were the things that women had to put up with daily. And I have to say that there are a lot of women of my vintage who didn't stay, which was unfortunate because I think they would have added great value, but were discouraged by an environment in which they were disrespected and devalued and not seen as equal to their male colleagues. And so that sort of really struck me as an environment and a situation that I thought was very unfair. And I actually probably unconsciously made it my mission at that point in time to do what I could in the course of my career to help change that. Now, I speak from experience. I myself was a victim of a rape when I was 19 years old. In my second year in the Navy, and I was under training, and it occurred on a Navy base by a Navy person. And at that time, I didn't feel there was anything I could do about it. We didn't have any policy around inappropriate behaviour or unacceptable behaviour, or even the more serious crimes of rape and sexual assault, let alone sexual harassment. There was no avenue to make a complaint, to report it. Well, not that we were sort of made aware of, and again, I think that was a sign of the way in which, women's roles and women's place in that organisation. So for me, it was a matter of just actually literally getting up and getting on with the day and finishing my training. And I didn't tell anybody. And I didn't tell anybody for about 15 years. And I just let it sit there. I think that was also all part of, this notion I had that I was going to be part of change, and which subsequently played out in the career roles that I had, more so in the last 20 years. But I thought there's always going to be a place for women particularly to challenge the system, to challenge our limitations, to challenge the way in which we were being treated, not by the organisation itself. And I do want to say that I'm very proud of being a Navy person, a Navy officer, and always have. And I think it's a very, as I said to you earlier, it's a wonderful career, and I think that it's got great ideals and great intent. There are just individuals or pockets of people, pockets in certain areas around the military that even today still disrespect women, and that's unfortunate. But anyway, at that time, I kind of just sat, as I said, I sat with this and I let it be. And it wasn't really until the Defence Abuse Response Task Force, I think back in about the mid-2000s, that started to look into the issue of, sexual misconduct within the Australian Defence Force, that there was an opportunity for women like me to be able to tell the story. And we did tell our stories. I think that was a great way for women who were still serving, who had experienced this, to be validated, to say, this was a really bad thing that happened to you and it shouldn't have happened, and hopefully it's not going to happen in the future. But we want to say that this is not who we are as an organisation. And I always felt that, like I said, it's not the organisation itself, but it was a male-dominated profession and always had been. I think when I joined, I think the percentage of women in the ADF was around about 7%. Now it's around 20%, which is great. That's still not a huge growth over 40 years, but we were a very small minority, and that made it very difficult for us to really, I think, be seen, be heard. I think that was sort of, for me, a disappointment. As I said, I'd had, seen my parents serve in the Air Force and the stories about them and, pictures of them, and thought this was a wonderful career to go into, and then sort of kind of really hit like this in terms of what my first few years of service were like. And to be honest, that environment in which women daily felt uncomfortable about being at work because, there was misogyny, there were sexist jokes, there was the pornography on, work, even in the workplace, the constant sort of humiliation and, mistreatment that women were experiencing, and not feeling that there was an opportunity to be able to even do anything about it or say anything about it. That all changed, by the early 90s. When the government lifted the gender restrictions on combat-related roles. And that meant that a whole range of roles within the ADF were being opened up to women, including driving ships, flying aircraft, driving tanks, all sorts of things. And again, that signalled another change for the organisation, where I think when men were starting to think, oh my gosh, women are now starting to, take away the last bastions of, our sort of maleness, and we were. Not because, there was this ongoing fight between men and women to do these roles, but because the sign of the times was, socially and in public, things were changing. And women had to, in terms of equal opportunity, women had to have these roles available to them. I think, history will show that women have performed probably, just as well or if not better than men have in all of these roles, including combat roles that have been opened now to women since 2016. So opening up those sort of combat-related roles really it changed the environment. It was also around about the same time that Defence was starting to really crack down on the inappropriate and unacceptable behaviour. They were starting to develop appropriate policies to address incidences as they occurred or complaints that were raised, making it very clear that, you know, the mistreatment of anybody in the workplace was totally unacceptable. And there's still been a lot of work that's been done since the mid-90s and still is ongoing in terms of the culture in which we expect our people to operate. But that was a really, you know, a time in which, when I look back now, I'm thinking the mid-90s, that's like really modern times, right? And now, of course, it's not. But that was when we started to put, for the Navy anyway, started to put women on ships at sea. And I had my sea posting to HMAS Swan, which was a Vietnam War era destroyer escort in 1995, and I was the head of the logistics department, so I was the supply officer of the ship, and I went as a fairly senior person, so I didn't have the benefit of service at sea that my male colleagues had. You know, since they'd joined, they'd done their sort of time as young officers, learning the ropes. I was sort of pretty much fully thrown in at this senior level as one of the heads of department on the ship. And there were many other women who were in a similar position. So they were sending women to sea who were like me, who had done 15 or 16 years service by that stage, literally never stepped foot on a ship before. Chief petty officers, and of course some more younger women sailors as well too, as they started to recruit women into these combat-related roles like technicians, radar operators, a whole range of sort of kind of technical roles, ship driving roles, bosuns on ships and things like that. Women were coming into these roles, and therefore more women were going to be posted to ships. And again, it's a bit like, for the men it was like, it's sort of like, oh my gosh, we've got women on our ships now, like this is not the Navy that I joined. And so we were starting to be a show of force. But there were still issues because, of course, just by virtue of the slow recruitment of women into these roles, wanting to get women like me, for example, in logistics on ships, it was a slow process, and it was also meant that very few numbers went in any one ship. So, in fact, on my ship, there was only 2 women in a crew of 212, and so that itself was not easy. And I was one of the heads of department, as I said, and the other woman was the deputy weapons electrical officer. And so at least she was an officer, so at least we had a little bit of mutual support. But I went at a time which came after an experiment, and I call it an experiment because I don't think the Navy did it very well at the time, but they tried to put a group of women on board the same ship that I served on, and things didn't go very well. And it's all on the public record in terms of the issues that arose out of that, the mistreatment of some of the women, the behaviour of some of the men. There was a big inquiry into it, and they essentially took all the women off. And it was things like that that made people say, well, why are you trying to put women on ships at sea? See, it didn't work, right? And it wasn't an experiment, of course. It was a matter of saying where women are entitled to do these jobs, and if they want to do these jobs, they have to serve at sea, because our reason for being in the Navy is serving on ships and doing our job at sea. So it wasn't an easy role for me either, as I said, going in at the fairly senior level, not having had previous sea experience. And it wasn't just the senior logistics officer, I was also the helicopter control officer. So pretty much the person who does brings the aircraft in on the back of a ship. In our case, not to land, because it wasn't like a FFG, which has a quarterdeck, but it had a landing base, but bring helicopters in to drop supplies off or pick people up or whatever. And I was also one of the nuclear, biological and chemical defence officers. And these are 2 key roles on a ship where you've got people's lives at risk. People are looking to you for leadership. They're looking to you to make sure that, for you to know, you need to know what you're doing, right? You need to keep these people safe. And I guess as an example, one day we had a helo coming in. It was a Army helo. And I had myself up on the Seacat deck of this ship, so I'm sort of a little bit higher, doing my instructions to the helicopter pilot. We were not in radio contact. I was in radio contact with the bridge. The helo pilot's in contact with the bridge, but there's no radio contact between the pilot and myself. So he has to obey all my hand signals, and he wasn't. And he wasn't a Navy pilot, he was an Army pilot. Maybe we assume that he knew them, I don't know, whether he did or he didn't. But it actually got to a point where I thought he was going to try and land. I thought he didn't know that he couldn't land on the back of our ship. And I had 3 or 4 sailors down on the quarterdeck waiting for the aircraft to hover. And afterwards, because he sort of seemed to be coming in so close, and then he hovered. And then, he dropped off his load, and then he flew off. But it was like, later we talked and we said, was that guy going to try and land? And we were honestly getting ready to jump over the side of the ship if that guy tried to land. So that's how scary and, sort of how dangerous, I guess, these kind of situations are. So for me as a woman officer, so I was there first sea posting, never had done this, as a junior officer, never got the runs on the board as a young person. These are the situations that I had to deal with that were that I was so unfamiliar with and very uncomfortable with in terms of not being fully prepared in terms of experience and training to manage. But I did, and as a logistics officer, everybody got fed and everybody got paid and the ship stayed afloat, and, we decommissioned the ship later in the year and everything went smoothly. Although I did hear later that there was some story floating around that I'd let the ship, because the ship was actually sunk as a dive wreck off Western Australia, that I'd actually let the ship be sunk with the safe still full of money. So I thought that was absolutely hilarious that I'd even let that happen. But anyway, everything went well. And I actually really had a fantastic time, and it was a really good growing experience for me. I had a couple of times when I had to deal with men who felt that they could take the opportunity to try and intimidate me or harass me. And it wasn't sexual harassment. It was just treating me as though I shouldn't be on the ship, like I was not the sort of person they wanted in their ship's company. And, it would have been a similar experience for people who might come from other minority groups. For example, those from the gay community, other minority ethnicities, kind of all suffered the same things that, women have experienced. And one of them was a sailor, and one of them was actually a peer on the ship, so another head of department, who literally did not want women on his ship. And here I was, he's equal in terms of rank, seniority, obviously different roles. But I expected to be a respected member of the heads of department team, and he was not treating me that way. And there were certain times I recall where he would say things that would totally embarrass me or totally embarrass the other male heads of department sitting at the table, who were then embarrassed for me because, this is the way I was being spoken to. And this continued, for some time until I went to the commanding officer, who happened to be good friends with this particular officer, and I said, this is what's been happening and I want it to stop. And let me give you an example. We were alongside somewhere, I can't remember where, Philippines maybe, and we were having a bit of a party in the wardroom at the bar. After we'd pulled alongside, done all our work, we were free, it was downtime, and alcohol was being consumed, and he was just being a little bit obnoxious and actually called me a blonde bimbo in front of the rest of the wardroom, particularly all the younger male officers in there, who I recall were looking at him going sort of like, I can't believe you even said that, even then. And that was the kind of thing that I experienced on a daily basis. And, so totally unwarranted, because I was doing my job, I was doing it well. Funnily enough, when we left the ship, we both left with sort of similar annual performance reports, and so there was no reason for him to have treated me in any way other than a colleague. So that was, you can imagine if that was happening to me, it was happening to women all around the fleet. And so I'm sure that if you were to talk to a lot of women, you'd hear very similar stories of their first experience at sea. Now, again, in this day and age, it's perfectly normal for women and men to serve on ships at sea, and nobody thinks anything about it. Everybody just does their job, and that's the way it should be. But it was a long, hard road to get there. And it was sort of women of my vintage, who kind of, they had to bear the brunt of the changes that were occurring. So again, I guess it was another time in my life when I thought, what the hell? What have I done? What organisation have I joined? But there were so many other good times as well too, and I've had some wonderful postings that have been very uplifting, and where you get that sense of service and where you feel that you're actually making a difference, and you see the change that's coming and you want to be a part of it. And that's, I think, what spurred me on to stay as long as I did, and eventually to move into the roles in which I was actually part of sort of the cultural reform and the change that was occurring within Navy, which was around sort of about 2009 onwards. And that included changes around the way we treat people in the workplace, behaviour, valuing everybody's contribution, respecting everybody, in the workplace, the people that you work with, the teams that you work with, regardless of gender, ethnicity, sexual identity, like all those things now that we just, again, we take for granted in the workplace. We say this is the life we live in now, right? And again, it was a long, hard road to get there.